Uh, any general questions or comments before I get started about things in the reading or other stuff? Yes?
Wasn't the name Yahweh, wasn't that like outlawed to be used in religious texts in some different churches?
That's an interesting question.
Because I know
Yeah.
that, like, I'm Catholic, and I know one of the songs we always sing, it got changed to, like, Lord or something, because you can't say Yahweh.
Yeah, and that's interesting. This name probably deserves at least a little bit of commentary. Comes from 4 Hebrew letters. Might as well just write it up like that. Right. In Hebrew, at least ancient Hebrew, and even today when you get vowels, they're added above and below, right? As Hebrew historically is written just consonants, right? You get a development in languages from pictograms into an alphabet, often initially just providing consonant sounds, almost like a shorthand way of writing the language, and eventually get systems developing that include vowels as part of their alphabet. In Hebrew, there are essentially 4 consonants, right? Because sometimes why, you know. And so this is our best reconstruction, as it were, of what the name of God was pronounced like. For many of you, this is a name that you have not encountered, even if you've read the Bible often. And why is that? Well, it goes back to something that we'll have occasion to talk about, and I usually actually bring this up around when we get to Exodus and talk about the 10 Commandments, because it seems like a natural place to bring it up. One of the 10 Commandments is to not take God's name in vain. And it's referring to this name, right, the divine name, Yahweh. And there's an ancient rabbinic tradition, right, that essentially attempted to do what's called, they sometimes describe it as drawing a hedge around the law, right? So if this is something that's marked out as sinful, right, we should presumably make it like that, right? Don't go there. They would try and keep people away from that, so that even if you accidentally cross this line, you aren't still ending up in the really bad place. And the rabbis asked themselves, how do we get people not to accidentally take God's name in vain? I wonder if there's anyone here who has never, perhaps not used an title or way of referring to God or some other divine figure. But is there anyone here who's never said something that if they'd had the forethought to think about it, they'd been a bit calmer, they might not have? Right? Sometimes when we're hot-headed, we say things that we are sorry for afterwards. In the case of blasphemy, the penalty was stoning, and so you might not have had much chance in this particular context to be sorry afterwards. And so how do you keep people from accidentally misusing the divine name? As illustrated in a famous Monty Python movie for some of you, right? You may remember that scene. One way is to get people out of the habit of saying the divine name altogether, right? If people don't use it, then you're not going to say, oh, and blurt something out that will get you into trouble, possibly as much trouble as death. Right? And it's from that the custom came about, which leads to our current Bible translations in English, most of them, of using Lord in capital letters where the divine name occurs in the Hebrew text. Should I have just started now? I don't know. Funny beat. And so a lot of you reading Bibles have Lord in capital letters, right? And that's what's actually in the Hebrew text, is the divine name. And so the divine name is all over the Hebrew Bible, but rare in English Bibles. And it's interesting that you mentioned that you'd encountered this issue in a Catholic context. One of the few modern English translations that actually uses the divine name rather than substituting Lord is the New Jerusalem Bible, which is a Catholic translation. And it's a translation that has a lot of interesting features, not only this one, that make it worth taking a look at if you're interested in the Bible and reading it in English. But most translations have Lord in capital letters, and so it goes back to that rabbinic custom. You'll sometimes, or you may have encountered it rendered in this way, right? Right, some of you. And that goes back to something that became the custom once vowels were added to the Hebrew text in its transmission, to remind people not to pronounce the name, right, and to substitute the Hebrew word for Lord, which is Adonai. What the scribes did was to put the vowels from Adonai around the divine name, right? And it basically made it unpronounceable. And so even if you came across the series of consonants and tried to start pronouncing it, that would remind you. Early translators of the Bible into English basically found, didn't know Hebrew well enough to realize that was what was going on, and basically put the vowels from Adonai that were in the text together with the consonants from Yahweh together, and there was, Y and J. You get some interchange in a lot of Hebrew words when they're rendered into English. A lot of that because it comes by way of German, long story. But essentially combine the vowels from the Hebrew word for Lord with the consonants from the divine name Yahweh, and you get this sort of hybrid form, but which probably doesn't reflect as closely how it would have been pronounced in ancient Hebrew. So there you go. So this is something that definitely would have been mentioned today as well, because one of the things you'll notice as you start reading, right, and it's going to be important as we look at the first few chapters of Genesis, is noticing where the divine name Yahweh appears, because there are parts where it appears and parts where it doesn't. And so I'm glad you brought this up, because I needed to at least introduce this a little bit today. Is that clear? Is that enough information? Anyone want more information? Anyone want less information? There's not much I can do at this stage, but yeah. Essentially, it was, if you get out of the habit of saying the divine name altogether, then you're less likely to blurt it out in an angry moment when you're not thinking straight.
So, but in our interpretation of Lord, like if we use the Lord's name as name, which, like Lord God, Jesus, those are all still considered in vain, correct? They are in our language?
That depends on, I think, how you're interpreting. Obviously, if we're talking about the meaning of the Hebrew text, right? If the Hebrew text has been translated in English with Lord, the Hebrew text was referring to the name, right? And one of the things that becomes, a point of confusion probably for a lot of readers is that it would be understand words like Lord or God as names of God, whereas in fact, ancient Israelites understood their God to have a name, right? And that name was Yahweh, right? So it wasn't just one that was an entity that was referred to using generic titles, we might say, such as Lord or God. So whether you treat that or whether some tradition treats that as a divine name, it's really up to that tradition. But the Hebrew text is referring to the name in that case, right? So there you go. Yeah. Am I going to be blamed for an increase in types of swearing that some of you engage in? That wasn't my aim today. If that's a knock-on effect, I hope I won't be held accountable. Am I going to be getting letters from people like, I've just noticed this person? No, never mind. Let's. Any other general questions? And if you're looking for more polite ways of swearing in English, right? You've been introduced in this chapter to the Hebrew word Sheol, right? This place of the dead, sort of shadowy place. Not exactly the equivalent of hell or Hades or anything else from any other tradition. But if you're looking for creative ways of swearing, you can only say, what the Sheol, right? And so there you go. In fact, I know somebody who actually says that. Whether it's more polite or not, I don't know. Probably depends on how well the people who are around you know Hebrew.